Well, good afternoon and welcome. My name is David Sinden. I'm the Director of Music at St. Peter's Episcopal Church in St. Louis. And this presentation today is part of our Living Tradition series. This is a series that we've started in celebration of 30 years of choral evensong at St. Peter's Church. And since we're obviously not able to gather to sing evensong this year, we thought we would take the celebration in a different direction. So we're exploring liturgy and music. And Samantha has agreed to come today and talk about the first Anglican hymn book, which I think is a wonderful introduction to inclusion in a series like this to really focus in on hymns and their origin in the Episcopal Church. There's not a service in the Episcopal Church today, evensong or morning services of Holy Communion, where you can easily get out of singing a hymn. So hymn singing is a big part of our tradition, and I think it's worth our time and attention today. So Dr. Samantha Arten has a PhD in musicology from Duke University, and one of her recent focuses has been this Whole Book of Psalmes, which is the subject of her presentation today. So we're very fortunate to have one of the foremost experts in this field, someone who, as I understand it, has traveled around the world in search of original copies of these volumes. So Samantha, thank you very much and welcome.
Thank you so much. It's such a pleasure to be here. I have been delighted to sing with the St. Peter's Choir for a couple of years now, and this is my first opportunity really to tell the church much about my research. I've been studying the Whole Book of Psalms for about 6.5 years now. It was the topic of my dissertation for my PhD at Duke, and continues to be the topic of the journal articles that I'm publishing and my hopefully forthcoming book that's still in progress. So thank you so much for this opportunity. I'll start out with our hymnal 1982. You may have noticed every now and then that our hymnal lists down at the bottom for the source, Day's Psalter as the source of a tune. In fact, it's for St. Flavian. I have no idea why it's called St. Flavian, but it says St. Flavian from Day's Psalter. Every time I see this, I get kind of gleeful and kind of irritated because Day's Psalter, also known as the Whole Book of Psalms, has been the primary focus of my research for so long. But also, it was definitely not called Day's Psalter, so I'm not sure why they've listed that as the title. Today, I'm going to share a bit about this first hymnal of the Church of England, talking about what it looks like, how it got started, and what it says about us, about we Anglicans as a singing people. The English Reformation, of course, being one of the first moments where focus shifted from music making by professional choir and clergy to hymn and other congregational song performed by the congregation. So I will share my screen. I have lots of pretty pictures. Okay, oops, back one page. This is the title page of the Whole Book of Psalms, first published in 1562. It was then reissued at least once every year, often in multiple editions with dramatically differing formats. This book very rapidly became a symbol of English Protestantism, along with the Book of Common Prayer, the authorized books of homilies, and of course, the English translation of the Bible. And in fact, as I've gone around looking at original copies, the Whole Book of Psalms was often bound up with one or more of these, as if the English Bible naturally goes along with the Whole Book of Psalms, or the Book of Common Prayer naturally should be bound together. This chart is slightly out of date. This is the version that was published in my dissertation. Every box represents a surviving edition of the Whole Book of Psalms. So you could see the first edition in 1562. There were one edition each in 1563 and 1564. And as we go on, there are more and more editions published every year, often in dramatically differing formats. So we'll come back to this and I'll explain the significance of the different colored boxes. There are, in fact, 143 extant editions published in Elizabethan England. So that's 1562 through 1603. And this is really significant because most other English hymnals or metrical psalters or collections of music appeared in only one edition. So 143 says, this is significant on a level far beyond pretty much every other book of music published in early modern England. And even if you estimate a conservative print run of 1,500 copies per edition, there could have been 220,000 copies of the Whole Book of Psalms in circulation by 1603. So one scholar estimates one book for every 18 inhabitants of England and Wales, and perhaps 1 million copies produced by 1640. It was one of the best-selling books in Elizabethan England, and its publishing rights were protected by royal privilege. So strictly speaking, only one person was allowed to publish this Psalter. There were pirated editions, as would happen with any best-selling book. But for the most part, all of its printing was governed by this Psalter printing patent. So this book was intended as a devotional text, a musical songbook, and, as I argue in my dissertation, a music textbook. It contained 21 hymns and canticles, plus metrical settings of all 150 psalms. These were set to 65 printed musical tunes, and it also included some prefatory material that was Protestant and musical in nature. So we'll come back to the music educational preface in just a second. But this also included a translation of a letter by St. Athanasius, one of the church fathers, about why you should sing the Psalms, and if you're feeling this particular emotion or you're in this particular situation, you should sing this psalm number. So it was very much framed as a very practical and useful book. My dissertation, in fact, argued that the Whole Book of Psalms attempted to promote musical literacy for the common people. A lot of modern hymnals will include a little bit of material in the prefatory material on how to read music, how to sing, why we should sing, and this hymnal was no exception, and I think sort of initiated that trend. Okay, so what is a metrical psalm? These are images of the two openings for Psalm 1. So we have prefatory material, then we have these hymns and canticles, and then we get to the main body of the book, the Psalms of David. So a metrical psalm is a versified interpretation of the Psalms. So this isn't prose, this isn't exactly what's printed in the Coverdale Bible, and the sheer act of putting it into poetry means that out of necessity, this is an interpretation, and often a very Protestant one. Some scholars have gone through and traced how these particular psalm versions very much propped up the English monarchy, which was, of course, a really big part of the English Reformation. So what we see here are the musical tune with a text underlay for the first two verses of the psalm, and then subsequent verses are just printed underneath. So you have to learn and memorize the hymn tune in order to continue singing, because at this point you've turned the page, right? I think our modern hymnals that print the majority of the verses underneath the music are actually easier to read than is this book. As for the poetry itself, it was in common meter, sometimes called Sternhold's meter, after Thomas Sternhold. You see TS just here. Sternhold was the versifier of an awful lot of the Psalms in this book. Sternhold's meter means alternation of stressed and unstressed syllables in 14ers, or couplets made up of 8 syllables followed by 6 syllables. Da-dun, 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 da-da, 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 da-da. The man is blessed that hath no bent to wit give reed his ear, nor led his life as sinners do, nor sat in scorner's chair. So that's verse 1, Sternhold's meter. This is really familiar because a lot of English poetry, even to this day, remains in common meter. The very most famous psalm tune from this book, which was not printed in the first edition of 1562, but popped up pretty soon thereafter, is Psalm 100. We call this Old Hundredth, and it is because it is the tune assigned to Psalm 100, Psalm C, in the Whole Book of Psalms. And I thought it might be well worth us trying to sing this together. So I'll sing it, and hopefully with your microphone muted, you can try singing along too, as an example of what it would have been like to sing together as a congregation, or perhaps at home as a family, as part of domestic devotion out of this book. I'll return to these funny little letters printed before the music, so ignore those for now. I will also point out that in this last phrase, the rhythms are slightly longer than we're currently used to, so don't get tripped up. All people that on earth do dwell, sing to the Lord with cheerful voice. Hymns serve with fear, his praise forth tell. Come ye before him and rejoice. Cool, how was that? Easy to read, I hope. So, how did this book come about? It's actually a really fascinating story. It has origins both as courtly poetry, so scriptural poetry intended for the secular setting of the royal court. There was a real vogue for moralizing poetry in the Edwardian court, so the son of Henry VIII. This originated first as Thomas Sternhold's Certain Psalms, published circa 1547 through 1549, which contained 19, so only 19 of the 150 psalms, and no music. So just poetry intended for the court and for the king. A year-ish later, so definitely in 1549, John Hopkins expanded this out. So it's the Sternhold and John Hopkins All Such Psalms, and it contains 44. But still courtly poetry, still no music. Then what happened is Edward died and Mary Tudor ascended to the throne. She, of course, was Catholic and reverted the entirety of England to Catholicism. And so a great many English Protestants actually had to flee to the continent. A number of them ended up in Geneva, where they hung out with John Calvin and the Genevan Church. And so these English Protestants in Geneva created a new order of worship, so liturgical order. You can see it here on the left. It's the form of prayers and administration of the sacraments. And this included, so about halfway through, this is the second page, 150 Psalms of David in English meter, whereof 37 were made by Thomas Sternhold and the rest by others. So what this did was they took and expanded Sternhold and Hopkins' work and expanded it out. So included new psalms, some by Sternhold and Hopkins, and of course others. But the key point here is they converted what was courtly poetry into congregational song, and they included music for the first time. So they added 7 new psalms plus a hymn called the Commandments of God, i.e. the 10 Commandments. And they added music, a different tune for each psalm. So here on the left is that Psalm 100 that we sang from just a second ago from the Whole Book of Psalmes. And here you can see the origins of this Psalm 100 in the Genevan Psalter by Moreau and Beza. In case you're not familiar with it, allow me to sing it for you. It will sound familiar. Hors du servitre du Seigneur, vous qui de nuit en son honneur, de dans sa maison le servez, louez-les, son nom élevé. One of the interesting things about this adaptation from the Genevan Psalter style into what we call the Anglo-Genevan Psalter of these exiled English Protestants is that while they borrowed a couple of tunes, of which Psalm 100 eventually became one of them, mostly they wrote new tunes in the style of the French Geneva Psalter, which is cool, except that the French language has really different stresses than the English language. So in French, the first word of a phrase is often stressed. But in English, this is often an unimportant word. The, a, all, o. So pretty much all of the tunes in the Whole Book of Psalms start with a long note and then continue on with short notes, which means it doesn't actually suit the English language nearly so well as the style suited the French language. So eventually Mary died and Elizabeth I ascended the throne, brought back Protestantism to England. The English exiles went back home and they took with them their Anglo-Genevan Psalter. A guy by the name of John Day, who was a Protestant printer of mostly not music, got hold of this and sort of created this project to complete the Psalter. Of course, it was called 1 in 50 Psalms of David in English meter by the Genevan exiles. It wasn't all 150 Psalms, but Day set about hiring people to finish. So first he published 4 partial Psalters, Psalms of David in English meter in 1560, Psalms of David in English meter in 1560 or 1561, 407 Psalms of David, and then finally the residue of all David's Psalms in meter. And then eventually in 1562 published the Whole Book of Psalmes, which did in fact include all 150. I'll pause there in case you have any questions, and then I'll talk about what the Whole Book of Psalms says about Anglicans as its singing people.
I have a question.
Of course.
It's very interesting in that first page where it says very meet to be used by all sorts of people, which I think is the title. But then it talks about terrible songs and ballads, which tend about corrupting youth. So was music seen to be, the cure of all evils?
I'm so delighted you've asked this. I've been thinking about it a lot because I'm actually in the process of publishing an article about how metrical psalm books in England had this really clear thread of sort of anti-ballad sentiment. The idea that secular ballads were ungodly and metrical psalms can provide a sort of godly alternative. So a lot of these title pages, not only for the Whole Book of Psalms, but also for other versified sort of metrical paraphrases of scripture, specifically promoted themselves as an alternative to ballads.
Oh, that's interesting. Just like Elvis Presley to our parents,
Yeah. Well, and it's especially funny because Protestants actually jumped on ballads as a popular genre and created their own godly ballads, which had religious and moralizing content, but that didn't seem to matter for the publishers of Whole Books of Psalms, who pretty much decried all ballads as immoral.
Oh, thank you.
Okay, so one of the things I've spent years thinking about is what this hymnal, as sort of the symbol of music making in early Protestant Reformation England, says about people. How should they be participating musically in services? And I want to start with the real problem of the English Reformation, which is that we have no single prominent musical reformer in the English Reformation. So the Lutherans, of course, had Martin Luther, who had a really highly developed theology of music. Sadly, he didn't put it all in one place, but many scholars have sort of traced across his writings as a whole, especially from his multiple liturgical orders. So sort of the liturgy for the new masses, which strongly advocated for congregational participation through communal song. And of course, the Calvinists had John Calvin. So here on the left, you can see one of the Genevan Psalters. In 1542, Calvin wrote a preface, you can see that here on the right, a preface for the Genevan Psalter, which was included in nearly all editions for over 100 years. And it's a really great resource. And if you want to know what Calvin thought about congregational singing, all you have to do is read this thing. And it makes a lot of sense. It definitely frames this hymnal and very directly shaped Calvinist music making. Some of the hallmarks of which are you can only sing things from the Bible, you can't sing any other devotional texts if they're not scriptural, and also organs are bad. We should only have the people singing together in unison unaccompanied. Okay, fine. In England, our most prominent reformer was, of course, Thomas Cranmer, but the only advice he ever recorded regarding musical reform was this quote, found in a private letter to Henry VIII. He wrote, quote, "But in mine opinion, the song that shall be made thereunto would not be full of notes, but as near as may be for every syllable a note, so that it may be sung distinctly and devoutly, as be in the matins and evensong, the Venite, the hymns, Te Deum, Benedictus, Magnificat, Nunc Dimittis, and all the psalms and versicles. And in the Mass, Gloria in excelsis, Gloria Patri, the Creed, the Preface, the Pater Noster, and some of the Sanctus and Agnus." Okay, this is a great quote, and that phrase "for every syllable a note" pops up a lot when people talk about sort of the underlying philosophy of English Reformation music. However, this advice was intended to refer to adaptations of Latin chant for the New English service. So we're talking about best practices in English chanting, and this was not intended as a guide to congregational or choral music. And also, unlike Calvin's very public preface, this was a private letter to the monarch, and probably nobody else really ever saw it. So, in the absence of a single prominent musical reformer, there was no complete worked out theology of music in the 16th century Church of England. And without writings like those of Luther or Calvin to turn to, scholars are forced to rely on a wide variety of primary sources. So usually the writings of very minor English reformers found in published works, sermons, and letters. And these things are not cohesive or consistent, and they don't represent a single preeminent theological understanding of music, guiding the Church of England or promoted by it. So one of the things that I've done as a music historian is argue that the Whole Book of Psalms is actually a surprisingly helpful source for understanding the theological account of music as presented to the common people in a period that had almost no formal guidance from religious officials about what you should be singing or how you should be singing it. Now, technically, the Whole Book of Psalms was not officially sanctioned by the Church of England or the monarch, but the title page makes claims that it was. And these claims were rapidly accepted by the populace and eventually even sort of tacitly accepted by the authorities. In fact, the third sort of re-up of the Psalter printing patent from Elizabeth actually kind of acknowledges that this is officially sanctioned by the monarch. So what, according to the Whole Book of Psalms, did it mean to sing as English Protestants during the years of the long English Reformation? And in short, congregational singing is all important. And what we should be singing is unaccompanied monophonic music. Monophonic means in unison, or rather at the octave, to accommodate both men's and women's voices. This, unlike pre-Reformation Catholic England, is not musical performance in liturgy restricted to priests singing chant or professional choirs singing ridiculously complex polyphony as in the Eton choir book. This also is not music in 4 parts or accompanied by an organ like most of our modern hymnal. These texts are in English, not in Latin, the shift to the vernacular, of course, being a really huge part of all of the Protestant Reformations. And like Cranmer's words, "for every syllable a note," these texts are set syllabically. So we get 1 note for every syllable, making the words themselves very simply declaimed and easy to understand. Most of these texts come from the Book of Psalms, as you might expect, but as I mentioned, there are also hymns and canticles, themselves drawn from either scripture or liturgy. So we have, for example, rhymed poetic versions of the Mag and the Nunc, the Te Deum, the Benedictus, the Venite. We have 2 settings each of the Lord's Prayer and the 10 Commandments, and we have various lamentations, complaints, and humble suits of a sinner. Interestingly, David, a lot of the Whole Book of Psalms tunes do end up harmonized in 4 parts. And if you're ever looking for something really nice, some of these Magnificat settings are really very sweet.
Was it later editions that harmonized those?
Not editions of the Whole Book of Psalms, but separate music collections.
Okay.
So if you read the title page and all of the text of the Whole Book of Psalms really carefully, together it makes a really powerful statement about who is able to sing. And this begins with the title page. Just as Sarah pointed out, it's clear about its intended audience. All sorts of people can use this book. Now, 16th century title pages functioned a little bit differently than our modern title pages, in that they sought to define their customers, thereby implying something about intended readership, central readership, and even excluded readership. Social status, level of education, and gender could be, and often were, strongly suggested by 16th century English printed title pages. The act of suggesting the ideal reader also included demonstrating who the audience was not, in order to persuade the proper audience to become purchasers of the book. So a title page in Latin might indicate the exclusion of those who read only English, and signaled a higher level of scholarship in the hope of attracting the more literate. The Whole Book of Psalms, on the other hand, does not exclude anybody from its readership, and it's actually a little bit unusual in sort of how broad a net it's trying to cast. It is, as the title page says, quote, very meet to be used of all sorts of people, and it also says it is for any who be afflicted, for the benefit of themselves and for one another. So this hymnal was meant to appeal to all church-going English Christians across the bounds of their particular religious affiliations. In this period, it wasn't as simple as everyone is English Protestant now. You have varying levels of strength of English Protestantism, ranging from moderate Anglicans all the way to stricter Puritans. And you also have Roman Catholics who still attend English churches. And that was okay. And as far as the government authorities were concerned, your private beliefs could stay largely private if you continue to go to English church every Sunday. So the preface that follows this title page is a short introduction into the science of music. And this title further reinforces the open readership. It says that this preface, and therefore the entire book, is, quote, made for such as are desirous to have the knowledge thereof for the singing of these psalms. So in other words, this psalter is for anyone who wants to sing psalms. And the implications are further, everyone can sing, and psalms are designed to be sung and not merely read. All of this is, of course, completely in keeping with Protestant thought, which sought to minimize the gap between laity and clergy. Now, the melodies themselves are pretty simple. They rarely span more than an octave, so they're pretty singable. No tune uses a complicated key signature. We only see one or no flats. And very few have any accidentals, flats, or sharps. They're all made up mostly of stepwise motion that fills in intervallic leaps. So they're very singable melodically. On the other hand, the rhythms are not so great. There's only 3 note values used: whole note, dotted whole note, and half note. But like I mentioned, the Whole Book of Psalms was based on the Genevan Psalter, and therefore on the rhythms of the French language, which means that unimportant words like the, nor, but, both, and get stressed, rather than much more important nouns and verbs that immediately follow. Altogether, the tunes of the Whole Book of Psalms attempted, with varying levels of musical success, to make sacred singing easy and accessible to the laity. The idea that singing is characteristic of Christian believers is reinforced by the versified and therefore interpreted psalm texts about music. So these particular versifications really emphasize who can sing and who cannot sing. And throughout the Whole Book of Psalms, the psalm texts themselves state that true believers can and should sing, and they are often exhorted to sing together as a community. So perhaps they often say, sing together with a single voice. The phrase "in one accord" or "with one accord" appears a lot. It's a convenient rhyme. Certainly, one accord pairs very nicely with Lord, which is helpful for a poetic form characterized by short phrases and frequent end rhymes. In fact, the Whole Book of Psalms has often been decried as doggerel because of these short phrases and frequent end rhymes. But the consistency with which the Whole Book of Psalms emphasizes the unity of Christians when singing communally in one accord remains really striking. And of course, it's easy to think in one accord means sing these monophonic psalm tunes together. I compared these texts to other versified psalm translations from the period, along with the Coverdale Bible, and the Whole Book of Psalms by far talks more about music than any of these other works. This is probably another good time to pause in case you have questions or observations or discussion.
There's one question that just popped up in the chat. Where do the anthems of Tallis and Bird, written during the 16th century, fit in this structure?
Good question. There's a couple ways to take it. The Whole Book of Psalms itself never published anything harmonized in more than one part, but some of the sort of psalm harmonization collections that started with Whole Book of Psalms tunes and then set them for 4 or 5 or 6 parts also included some short little anthems by Bird and Tallis. In 16th century England, I mentioned the Psalter patent. This sort of competed with the music printing patent, which was separate and owned by Bird and Tallis up until they died, and then it got taken over by Thomas East and others. So really only Bird and Tallis were allowed to be publishing music, and the fact that the Whole Book of Psalms had music kind of let it get away with printing music under the terms of a different patent. So there was absolutely polyphonic music going on, and sung by professional choirs, or even more often for domestic music making at home by people who knew how to read music and enjoyed sitting around the table after dinner together. But this was definitely a different thread of music making in Protestant England. All right, well, now I'll get to the vaguely music theory part of this talk and discuss how the Whole Book of Psalms attempted to teach musical literacy to the common people. So the central argument of my dissertation was that alongside its identities as a devotional scriptural text and a congregational hymnal, the Whole Book of Psalms served as a music instruction book. In fact, it was the first and most easily accessible work of popular music education printed in 16th century England. And it was born out of Protestant ideology regarding the Christian practice of music. This Psalter is evidence that English Protestantism not only saw verbal literacy as a primary goal, but musical literacy as well. If being a Protestant meant becoming an active part of musical worship, then it was crucial to teach all the laity to sing well, enabling them to fully inhabit that identity. So it does very little good to publish a hymnal if nobody can read it and therefore nobody can sing from it. So to accomplish this goal, the Whole Book of Psalms, various editions of the Whole Book of Psalms, included 2 main didactic features that aims to teach readers the rudiments of musical knowledge. The first you've already seen. It's the short introduction into the science of music, which serves as an instructional letter to the reader on the fundamentals of reading music. The second one is a system of printed psalmization syllables to aid in sight singing. So on the left here, you can see that 1-page preface. Now, these 2 musical prefaces never appeared together. The short introduction into the science of music was found in the first edition of 1562, and it serves as an introductory treatise in music theory, intended to aid readers in learning how to sing the Psalms and any other, and here I quote, plain and easy songs as these are. Starting in 1569, we start to get the psalmization preface. This book included a music typeface that contained psalmization syllables. So think do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do, except in the 16th century, we had ut, re, mi, fa, sol, la. And that's it. You can see that here, ut, re, mi, fa, sol, la, so, fa, mi, re, ut. So back to this chart of editions, the red boxes are all those that included that music preface. And the blue boxes are all those that included the psalmization preface and the psalmization syllables printed in the music. So you can see that the psalmization proved to be more enduring. Only 11 Elizabethan editions, or about 8%, contained the music preface, while 44 editions, or about 33%, contained psalmization along with the preface explaining their use. And one of the reasons I like this chart is it really clearly shows that pretty much every year had at least one form of musical didacticism among the various editions that were printed. Okay, so the music preface from the 1562 edition provided basic instruction into the fundamentals of music, and it advertised quick and easy learning. It says, I have set here in the beginning of this book of Psalms an easy and most plain way and rule, whereby any diligence given thereunto, every man may in a few days, yea, in a few hours, easily and without pain, and also that without aid or help of any other teacher, attain to a sufficient knowledge to sing any psalm contained in this book, or any such other plain and easy songs as these are. So this preface says it is easy and most plain, and claims that this is all you need to gain a working understanding of the rudiments of music theory. In only a few hours, without help from any other text or teacher, a student will gain all the knowledge he or she needs to sing these psalms and other plain and easy songs as these are. So if you turn the page, you find this chart of the gamut, which is whimsically printed in organ pipes. So the primary purpose of this illustration is to teach readers how to identify pitches. In this table, or gamma ut, is contained all what is necessary to the knowledge of singing, wherefore it must be diligently weighed and must also be perfectly committed to memory, so that ye can readily and distinctly say it without book, both forward and backward, that is, upward and downward. And this is the greatest pain that ye need to take in this travail. Other woodcuts that this preface includes teach readers the diverse forms of notes, and also explain the rhythmic value of rests, and also how dots, which it calls pricks, lengthen a note value by half. So we have 11 pages here of what it says are all the basics of music theory. In some ways, it doesn't contain quite enough, and in other ways, it contains a lot more than you actually need to sing the psalms contained in this book. In contrast, the psalmization preface is contained on a single page, and it covers only one concept: how to understand the psalmization syllables printed in the music throughout the Psalter. So here we're returning to those funny little letters printed before the music. In this case, you can see fa, fa, mi, re, ut, fa, sol, la. What appears like a traditional medieval hexachordal system is actually, I discovered, the very first example of a fixed scale psalmization system. And if that sounds really obnoxiously music theory, the point is that this little one-page preface printed in a book that was so ubiquitous that musicians don't really consider the Whole Book of Psalms among the music printed in Elizabethan England. This little one-page preface turns out to be a really significant step in the history of English music theory. And I was able to bump back this particular music theoretical concept by about 50 years. Together, these two prefaces were by far the most widely available music educational text for the common people, far and away more accessible than the other music theory textbooks printed in England, of which there were a few, but none of them got multiple editions like this one. And one of the things I found particularly interesting were the Protestant facets of these two prefaces. They both employ sacred and even scriptural language that allowed them to serve as religious instruction too, or even as prayers. They both emphasize that the musical skills taught were intended for the purpose of enabling and encouraging the singing of psalms. So the music preface explains that the singing of psalms is a godly exercise that serves as thanks and praise to God, and that this musical devotion could take place in a variety of settings and communities, both in church or at home. Meanwhile, the final section of the psalmization preface is even more prayerful in nature. It reads, "Thus I commit thee unto him that liveth forever, who grant that we may sing with our hearts and minds unto the glory of his holy name. Amen." These words serve as a benediction for the reader and singer, and uses language that we'll find very familiar, as if it's a liturgical collect. And it is assumed that this reader is gaining theoretical knowledge for the improvement of his or her devotional life. Which is great. I mean, how many music textbooks come with prayers? Okay, so I've given you a lot of pretty pictures about printed title pages or the things printed in the book. For this last section, your pretty pictures will be the marks that readers themselves put in their books. For this last section of the talk, I want to discuss how people actually used their whole books of Psalms. So we've looked at what it was for, what the publishers intended, what sort of prefatory material they printed so you could use it the way they wanted you to. Did people actually use it that way? We'll find out. So here's my methodology. Over the last 6 and a bit years, I have visited 32 rare book libraries to see 222 book copies. So I've seen over 200 copies of Elizabethan whole books of Psalms. And while I was doing this, I looked for the marks that readers put in the books themselves. These are called manuscript annotations. Manuscript meaning written by a person and not printed. And they can tell us about the individual book owner and his or her life, and about how that individual perceived the book in which they wrote. Taken collectively, annotations can teach us about practices of reading, material understandings of book ownership, and the roles that books played in their culture. I will spare you all the spreadsheets and mathematical calculations of my research and give you the end result. People were using their whole books of Psalms as if they were books, and especially like devotional books, but they were not using them like music books. What I mean by this is that it was really common in the 16th century for people to mark up their books with annotations that had nothing at all to do with the book's actual content. Paper was really expensive, so if you bought a book, you would make good use of the blank space on the page. So, some pretty pictures. I have seen things like doodles. This little stick figure with a lute is one of my favorites, and so is this little upside down horse. I have seen genealogy charts, math problems. On the right here, took us a while to figure this out. This is a financial table practicing the conversion of pennies to shillings. I've seen ownership marks. Here we have Frances Stafford, her book. I've even seen some devotional poems. This next ownership mark is probably my favorite. It reads, "Christopher Brown, his book. God gave him grace in him to look. If any chance him for to find, let him restore him, for 'tis mine." I think that's adorable. So the whole book of Psalms was treated like a typical book. It's an object to be written in. It was also treated like a devotional text. Many readers engaged with the printed text of the Psalter really thoughtfully. I have seen all kinds of annotations that comment on or correct the psalm text. Things like underlines or brackets and manicules or little pointed hands. These all serve, of course, to draw attention to particularly meaningful content. I've seen glosses and cross-references. This reader thought this particular psalm was very good. And I've seen other marginal commentary. Here ends the prayers of David, the son of Jesse. Other annotations include, oh wait, these are more glosses. Read this psalm, read and regard this psalm. These are all from the same book, by the way. Mark this, sing this psalm, take notice from this 9 verse unto the end of the psalm and mark it well. Right. So other annotations include corrections or modifications to the text, like crossing out repeated lines, completely rewriting entire lines, adding missing words, correcting spelling, and moving or adding part divisions. In this copy, one disturbed reader crossed out 2 lines about bloody wounds without offering any alternate text to fill in the 14er. So, don't like it, but now we can't sing it. In this copy, a reader added an entirely new verse in the same meter. And while it's been a while since I've worked on this particular copy, if I remember right, this is a variant verse that comes from the Scottish version of the Whole Booke of Psalmes. So lots of people marking up their texts, but it was a lot less common for people to create any markings that dealt with the Psalter's music or its music educational prefaces. So other printed music books of the period have all kinds of annotations marking up the music, things like adding bar lines, fixing accidentals, fixing notes that were printed poorly. I've seen a lot of these too, but I've never seen anything of the sort in Whole Books of Psalmes copies. And in fact, it even seems that people didn't necessarily sing the tunes that were actually printed. Here we see some examples of people writing their preferred tunes into the book. This reader didn't like the tune provided for Psalm 50, noting, quote, "This psalm is to be sung to the tune of the 25th psalm," while this reader preferred the tune of the 100th psalm over the tune printed for Psalm 14. And in this copy, a reader wrote in the name of other preferred tunes using the sort of geographically named tunes that originated around the end of the 16th century. Cambridge tune, Oxford tune, Dutch tune. And finally, once, and only once, in 222 copies, have I seen a correction to the printed music. Even though the Whole Book of Psalmes music was really, it was often printed really carelessly and occasionally so problematically that you can't even sing from it. My favorite example is an entire staff of music put in upside down and backwards, which of course kind of does away with any of the music educational content, because what good is it to try to teach people how to read music and then print the music so badly you can't sing off of it? But the prevailing notion among scholars is that people weren't necessarily singing their Whole Book of Psalmes tunes. In fact, many ballad tunes were also in common meter. So as long as you pick a tune that everybody in the group knows that has the same meter, you can theoretically sing this psalm to anything you want. So I will conclude here by saying that while the Whole Book of Psalmes is definitely the origin of congregational hymn singing in the Anglican tradition, and the very early parent of our own hymnal 1982, people read it really differently than we read our hymnal today. And I think my theologian husband might recommend we take a leaf out of their book and spend some time not just singing, but reading our hymn texts and meditating on their theological significance. So that's what I have for you today.
Samantha, thank you so much. This is just fabulous. So is it okay if we ask you some questions here at the end?
Absolutely.
Okay. I have some myself, but I want to open it to the floor first.
I have a question. Maybe I missed it in the first couple of minutes. Where did you find these 220 original old books?
Well, I've gone all over England and Scotland and Wales and America. There are copies of these in a lot of rare books libraries. So the British Library, the Bodleian, I've gone to a lot of universities to their special collections. Happily, there is a list online by edition and where you can find them.
So one of my questions is about logistics. So was it the norm that extant copies of these books would have been owned by parishioners and they would have been taken to and from churches? And if so, were they used primarily in the church or primarily in the home, or do you suspect evenly? What are your thoughts on that?
I suspect primarily at home.
Okay.
I think they would have been, displayed on the mantle along with the Bible. Particularly if you look at the notations, people weren't marking up the music, but they were marking up the text. Uh, there's a theory that the practice of lining out was being used in churches for church performance. For those who are unfamiliar with this term, lining out is where a cantor like me or David sings a line of a hymn to the congregation who then repeat it back, and this helps them learn it. This also has the added advantage of not needing everybody to hold their own whole book of Psalms, which is great because not all the editions can be used together. Some of them refer the same psalm to different tunes. So I think it much more likely that people were memorizing psalm texts and then just picking whatever tune they wanted.
So in that case, it was something that people were kind of doing at home outside of any formal religious service.
Well, that's where I think people were using the physical books, but metrical psalm singing actually really rapidly became a symbol of the English Puritans, who weren't all about choir music by Byrd and Tallis, but were very much of the Calvinist bent. We should all be singing together in unison with no organ, to the point where around the 17th century, the moderate Anglicans were really decrying those Puritans and their metrical psalms.
And then another question I have, and I'm not sure how to phrase this, it is interesting that our modern hymnal sort of has the authorization of our General Convention, that it is the officially sanctioned hymn book of the Episcopal Church. And you sort of alluded to this hymn book just becoming so popular that it gained kind of a popular authorization. It was just, what you used if you wanted to sing. But then it also sort of gained a royal imprint, at least sort of tacitly. What sort of impact do you think that had on the book's longevity, and were there any competitors to this book that were sort of vying for approval or authorization?
Oh, two good questions. I think the claim to religious authority and monarchical authorization certainly helped as it was getting started. Goodness, I've forgotten your second question already. Oh, were there any competitors? No, there weren't. The Psalter patent was really, really powerful, and this book was so popular that everyone just tried to turn out new editions in new formats. And it was like 300 years until the next, the new and authorized hymnal ended up taking over sort of cultural precedence. When I say different editions in different formats, they can vary quite a lot. Everything from like really teeny little pocket books that didn't include music to much larger folios, bigger than this, that were printed gorgeously with woodcuts and big margins and elegant scripts and like initials. So there was this huge variation, and it appears that editions each year were deliberately printed in the same size as the English Bible from that year so that they could get bound up together.
That's great. Any other questions from anyone? Feel free to use the chat.
Oh, okay. Gary has a question.
Well, I wanted to ask you about pitch. Is there anything written about what the sound of A was during this time? I know in Mozart, instead of 440, it was 438. How did they agree on what an A sounded like and what a B sounded like? Especially if there was no accompaniment.
Right. So there's tremendous argument among scholars of Tudor England about what A sounded like, which frankly I have not gotten involved in the slightest. The best argument I've seen is that any given town just sort of tuned its A to the local organ, and that even if they weren't using the organ for metrical psalms, just sort of the prevailing pitch would be taken from that because it was such a musical fixture of the town. I think it's really important to choose a starting pitch that will work for everybody. And in fact, the the printed tunes of the whole Book of Psalms, some of them are really not good for women. We can't sing them at pitch, but we also can't comfortably sing them up the octave. And I suspect people didn't sing them at absolute pitch, but just sort of picked something that worked for most people.
That's interesting that you raise the issue of men and women. There's nothing written about that in the preface, I assume, and I also assume that at home, everybody could sing. Were there limitations on who could sing in churches during this period?
I haven't found anything. I've been looking for years. Protestants are all about a literal reading of the Bible, right? So how did English Reformation Protestants deal with scriptural verses that seem to tell women to be quiet in church? The answer is they seem to have ignored these passages. I would love to find essays either explaining away these verses or, condemning people who don't follow them, but there is nothing. John, you have a comment about Sacred Harp. And you're absolutely right. I am by no means a Sacred Harp scholar, but anyone who is in Sacred Harp that I've talked to about the whole Book of Psalms seems to see the origin of their tradition in this hymnal, and particularly its accessibility and desire to make it plain and easy for everybody.
Oh, Samantha, if you weren't supposed to sing with the organ, what did the organ do? And how did the organ develop if no one wanted to hear it?
Well, some places tore down their organs in the English Reformation, which is very upsetting. Some places built them. Unlike Geneva and all the French Calvinists, or Zwingli, who was really against instrumental accompaniment, England's organ situation was kind of localized and not in any way consistent. There was a lot of great keyboard music being written. I mean, Byrd has a lot of great keyboard music, which could be performed in church if you had an organ and a keyboard player who could pull it off.
And so the harmonizations of these tunes that you saw later, that was probably partly a desire to give the organist some accompaniment for those. Is that right?
Oh, good question. I haven't seen organ accompaniment. What I've seen is part books. Okay. So the majority of vocal music in this time was printed in part books. So rather than a score where I, as a soprano, can look down the page and see what the basses are doing, I would just be handed a score that included the soprano part. And so each of the four singers would have their own part book, and they'd have to come together to hear what it sounds like put all together. The whole Book of Psalms has nothing of the sort because it's just the one line. But all of the harmonizations were printed in part book format, which was 100% normal for polyphony, even into the 17th century.
So at least in print then with those later editions, or those later books, not explicitly involving the organ yet.
No, there's theory though that people could line up multiple part books and an organ could play from all of them simultaneously. Thomas East's whole Book of Psalms, with their wanted tunes, and East does appear in our hymnal as well. East was printed in table book format, where all four parts were printed together on the same page, like in sections, not in score, but at least it's all on the same page together.
That's helpful.
Yes, it would be.
So what, in your mind, what are the one or two things in our modern hymnal 1982 that are sort of most closely drawn from the original whole Book of Psalms? Is it a tune only, or is there a tune and text pairing in there that's familiar? So sorry for a trivia question here.
Yeah. Well, it's definitely Old Hundredth, okay. But where we sing that as a doxology, that was not the original text that was printed. Mm-hmm. I believe Bruce will be hearing a bit more about that.
Right, an inadvertent segue.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, thank you again. I want to make sure I'm not stepping on anyone else's questions. So one final call for questions.
Thank you, Samantha. We really enjoyed your presentation. very educational. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well done.
Well, thanks.
Thank you.
Well, yes, thank you to Samantha, and thank you to all of you for attending. A recording of this talk and everything else that's gone on in the Living Tradition series will soon be available at livingtradition.online. And we'll gather again next week at this time to talk about the daily office. If you have a copy of this book, we're sort of doing a book study with Inwardly Digest by Derek Olson. But if you don't have the book yet, there's time to order it. If you don't like to read and you want to talk about the daily office, just come do that. That'll be fun. And then on March 21st at 1:30, again at the same time, please do join us again when we'll hear a little bit more about Old Hundredth through the poet that we know for that hymn text, Thomas Ken. Bruce Ryder is going to be leading a presentation about this Anglican bishop and hymn writer about whom not very much is known. And so Bruce is doing some biographical research. So yeah, with that, thank you very much.